The courtroom buzzed with the murmur of the crowd as people waited for their cases to be called. Maya Collins sat near the back dressed in a sleek dark suit and heels, her posture poised, but her mind sharp with focus. She had been in many courtrooms before, but today felt different, not because of the case that had brought her here, but because of how she had been feeling lately. The weight of constant scrutiny often felt heavier in spaces like this, but Maya had learned long ago to carry it with grace. She had spent years rising to the top of a career that demanded perfection, yet she knew too well how easily someone like her could be overlooked or misunderstood. As her case approached, she glanced at the papers in her hand. A minor traffic violation. She thought something simple, a mistake. Really, she had been misidentified for another driver in a different area on the same day. She had already cleared it with the local police department, but here she was at the courthouse anyway, ready to handle it the right way, confident that this would be over quickly. She didn't expect it to go any differently than most cases. She had seen the judge would listen, hear the explanation, and move on. Maya stood and walked to the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking lightly on the floor. The judge had already called her name, his voice sharp as he motioned for her to step forward. She was used to attention like this, but today she could feel an edge of something different in the air. The judge, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, barely glanced at her before beginning his questioning. "So you're here about a traffic violation?" he asked, his voice loud and demanding, not waiting for her to speak before continuing. "I see you've been issued a ticket for driving in an area you shouldn't have been." Maya calmly nodded, waiting for him to finish before speaking. "Your Honor, I believe this is a mistake. I was in a different part of the city at the time. I've already spoken to the local police, and they confirmed there was an error in the issuance of the ticket," she said, her tone respectful but firm. She knew this would be resolved quickly. It was just a misunderstanding, that was all. Judge Anderson looked at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. His lips pressed into a thin line before he spoke again. Dismissing her explanation, quickly he glanced at the paperwork in front of him before raising his gaze to her. "You expect me to believe that," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "There are no notes from the police here, so you'll have to pay the fine, I'm afraid." Maya blinked in surprise, trying to hold back her initial frustration. He wasn't even considering her side of the story. He was simply assuming she was lying. She had dealt with this kind of dismissal before. But this was different. This was blatant. She had expected more from the system, a system she had spent years working within. "Your Honor, I'm asking you to reconsider. I've already spoken to the authorities about this, and I have documents to back up what I'm saying," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it now that she couldn't hide. Judge Anderson raised a hand to silence her, cutting her off with a dismissive gesture. He wasn't interested in hearing more. His mind seemed already made up, and his decision was final. "You'll pay the fine, and that will be the end of it," he said, without room for argument. The room fell silent for a moment as Maya stood there, stunned, her mind racing. But she quickly regained control of her emotions, her professional composure taking over. She nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, though her voice held the weight of unspoken disbelief, and walked away. Maya stepped out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden door closing behind her with a soft thud. The moment she was outside, the cool air hit her face, but it did little to calm the frustration bubbling inside her. She stood there for a moment, her gaze focused on the ground, her mind racing. How had it happened? How had the judge so quickly dismissed her explanation without even considering her status, her reputation, her integrity? It was as if none of it mattered. She let out a slow breath, trying to shake off the sense of unfairness. This wasn't just about the fine. This was about the assumption he had made about her, the instant categorization, the erasure of her identity. It wasn't the first time she had faced such moments, but today it hit differently. She was used to fighting for recognition, but this was a blatant disregard for who she was, who she had worked so hard to become. A few steps away, she could hear murmurs from others in the hallway, voices low but pointed. Some of them had watched the interaction from the gallery, and she could sense the judgment in their eyes, even if no one dared to speak too loudly. It wasn't hard to guess what they were thinking. Another woman of color, another quick dismissal. She could almost hear the whispers. Asterisk, does she even belong here? Asterisk. Maya shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. This wasn't about them. This wasn't about what they thought of her. It was about the man behind the bench, a person with the power to decide her fate, who had barely taken the time to listen. He hadn't seen her for who she was, or even who she could be. He had only seen what he expected to see. Her car was parked nearby, and she made her way toward it with purposeful strides. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could feel the sting of the injustice, but she also knew that letting it fester would do no good. She needed to focus. Maya Collins, federal prosecutor, had faced bigger battles. This would not be the one to break her. But she couldn't ignore how this moment would weigh on her mind for the rest of the day, for the week, maybe even longer. It wasn't just about the unfair fine. It was the fact that in that courtroom, her identity as a black woman seemed to strip her of her professional identity, her years of experience, her hard-earned place in the legal world. As she sat in her car, the weight of it all settled in. She closed her eyes for a moment, her fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then, a decision formed in her mind. She wouldn't let this go. She wouldn't just pay the fine and walk away. Not this time. Not when the system had failed her so openly. Maya reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Carla Simmons, a reporter who had covered several of her high-profile cases. Maya dialed the number, and after a few rings, Carla answered. Maya, hey, what's up? Carla's voice was warm but curious. I need to talk to you, Maya said, her voice calm but laced with purpose. Something happened today at the courthouse, and I think it's time people hear about it. There was a pause on the other end. Go on, Carla said, now all business. Maya took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I just left a case where I was issued a fine for a traffic violation. The judge, without even hearing me properly, dismissed everything I said. He didn't consider anything. He just assumed I was lying. Maya's voice tightened as she spoke. He didn't see me. Not as who I am. Not as a prosecutor, a professional, a person who has worked in this field for years. He just saw me as someone he could dismiss. Carla was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of Maya's words. I'm listening, she finally said. Maya's resolve deepened. It was time to make sure this moment was more than just a painful memory. It was time to make sure this story was told. The next morning, Maya woke up with a sense of determination. The sting of the judge's dismissal still lingered, but she knew she couldn't let it fester. She had a choice: to move forward quietly and let this moment slip into the past, or to use her voice to spark a conversation that needed to be had. After a quick breakfast, Maya gathered her thoughts and made a few calls to her colleagues, some of whom had worked closely with her on major cases. They were all supportive, but it was Carla Simmons, the journalist she had reached out to the day before, who would be the first person to bring this story into the public eye. Maya's reputation as a respected federal prosecutor gave her credibility, but it was the power of her story, the kind of story that people could relate to, that would drive this conversation forward. Maya and Carla spoke for nearly an hour, discussing everything from the blatant bias Maya had encountered in the courtroom to the broader systemic issues at play. Carla was keen on getting Maya's perspective, and as the interview progressed, Maya's frustrations were met with understanding, not just sympathy. Carla's voice was calm, but Maya could hear the weight of her words, her realization that Maya's story was more than just about a single moment in a courtroom. It was about the assumptions people made based on how someone looked, on the instant judgments cast before anyone even had the chance to speak. I'll make sure people hear this, Carla said, her voice resolute. But this isn't just a story for me. It's a story that needs to be heard by a lot of people. I know, Maya replied, and that's why I'm sharing it. This isn't about a ticket. This is about the way Black professionals, especially women, are often overlooked and dismissed. It's bigger than me, bigger than today. It's about the people who go unnoticed every day. By mid-afternoon, Carla's article was live. The headline was direct and sharp. Asterisk judge finds Black woman without hearing her, only to realize she's a federal prosecutor asterisk. The piece was a detailed account of Maya's experience, touching on the judge's immediate dismissal, Maya's calm but firm efforts to explain herself, and the public backlash that followed. Within hours, the article spread like wildfire across social media platforms, with people sharing their outrage, their disbelief, and their support for Maya. Hashtags like hashtag listen to black woman and hashtag bias in the courtroom quickly gained traction, sparking conversations that ranged from casual discussions to heated debates. Some were quick to criticize the judge for his behavior, questioning whether his actions reflected a deeper issue of racial bias in the legal system. Others, including legal experts, expressed concern about how such biases could impact not just individuals, but entire cases in a courtroom. Maya was inundated with messages, supportive ones, of course, but also some that were less kind. However, it was the wave of support that kept her going. Fellow attorneys, colleagues from her federal team, and advocates from across the country reached out, expressing solidarity. A few even suggested they might be able to help her take legal action if necessary, but Maya didn't respond to that part immediately. She wasn't interested in a legal battle, not yet. She wanted this to be a conversation, not a lawsuit. As the day turned into night, Maya sat down in her living room, reading through the reactions. She couldn't help but feel both empowered and exhausted. It had been a long time since she'd felt this kind of weight on her shoulders, but it was different now. She wasn't carrying it alone. She had a platform, and she had a voice. But even with all the support, Maya knew the journey ahead would not be easy. The system didn't change overnight. The work had just begun. By the following morning, the conversation surrounding Maya's experience was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story, and social media was abuzz with people weighing in on the judge's actions. The public outcry was swift and loud. As the story spread, it was clear that Maya's encounter in the courtroom had struck a nerve with many people, particularly black women who had faced similar discrimination or dismissiveness in professional and public spaces. Maya had anticipated a reaction, but the scale of it was overwhelming. Her phone rang constantly with calls from friends, family, colleagues, and journalists seeking interviews. But it wasn't just the media that was paying attention. Many of the legal professionals who worked alongside Maya, from prosecutors to defense attorneys, reached out to her with messages of support. Some shared their own stories of bias they had encountered, while others praised her for speaking out about an issue that was often swept under the rug. The most poignant messages came from women in the legal field who shared their own frustrations. A few had faced similar dismissals from judges and colleagues, while others spoke about the isolation they felt as black women in a predominantly white field. One message in particular stood out to Maya, a law professor from a prestigious university who had written a lengthy post detailing the implicit biases she had observed in her own classroom. She spoke of how often black women in her classes were overlooked for opportunities, their ideas dismissed or plagiarized by their peers. The professor offered Maya her full support and suggested they connect to talk about ways to address these issues in the legal community. Maya read the messages over and over again. She was moved by the outpouring of solidarity, but also overwhelmed by the responsibility that now seemed to be on her shoulders. This wasn't just about one judge's mistake anymore. It was about systemic bias, about how society and the legal system treated people based on their race and gender. Maya knew that change wouldn't come from simply addressing one isolated incident. It would take much more than that. She needed to decide how to navigate the next steps. Her thoughts were interrupted by a message from Carla Simmons. The journalist had been working hard to track down reactions from legal experts and public figures, and her follow-up piece was set to publish that afternoon. The article would delve into the broader implications of Maya's story and the larger issue of bias in the judicial system. Maya was grateful for Carla's insight. She knew the journalist was using her platform to keep the conversation going, but she also understood that things could escalate quickly. Before she could respond to Carla, Maya's phone buzzed again. This time, it was from a number she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered the call. Maya Collins. A voice on the other end asked, its tone polite but stern. Yes, this is Maya. Judge Anderson here. I've been following the coverage of your case, and I wanted to personally apologize for my actions in court yesterday. Maya blinked in surprise. This was the last person she had expected to hear from. Judge Anderson, I didn't expect to hear from you, she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. I understand that, he replied quickly. And I'm not calling to make excuses. What I did was wrong. I didn't listen to you, and I made assumptions based on your appearance. That's something I deeply regret. Maya remained silent for a moment, absorbing his words. She had expected some form of apology, but hearing him admit his mistake so directly took her by surprise. She had no idea where this conversation would go, but she knew it was significant. I appreciate your apology, Maya said cautiously, but this goes beyond one mistake. It's about a broader issue that many of us face in this system every day. I'm glad you recognize what happened, but I hope you'll take this as an opportunity to think more deeply about the biases that exist in this court and in others. I will, Judge Anderson said with sincerity in his voice, and I want to do more than just apologize. I plan to attend a series of seminars on racial bias in the legal system. I've already spoken to my colleagues about it. I want to ensure this doesn't happen again. Maya nodded, though he couldn't see her. That's a step in the right direction, Judge Anderson. But actions speak louder than words. I know, he responded. I will make sure my actions reflect my commitment to change. I understand now how important this is. Maya took a deep breath, trying to process the unexpected turn of events. Thank you, said. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure that this issue is addressed systemically. We need to keep talking about it, and we need to make real changes. I agree, Judge Anderson said, and I'll do everything I can to be part of that change. As the conversation ended, Maya felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. The judge had apologized, and his acknowledgement of his mistake was a step forward. But Maya knew that one apology wouldn't erase the years of bias embedded within the system. This was just the beginning, and there was much more work to be done. In the days that followed, Maya found herself at the center of a growing movement. The conversation sparked by her story didn't die down. If anything, it only gained momentum. News outlets continued to cover her case, but the story had transformed into something much larger, a reflection of the biases faced by women of color in professional spaces, particularly in the legal system. Maya knew the power of her voice, but she also knew the weight of it. She had spent years as a federal prosecutor, working tirelessly to prove herself in a system that often made her feel like an outsider. She had climbed the ranks by earning her place, not by waiting for opportunities to be handed to her, but by working twice as hard to make sure her skills and judgment couldn't be ignored. Yet now it was clear that the battle she faced wasn't just about legal cases. It was about the systemic biases that could undermine even the most qualified professionals based on their race and gender. As the days passed, Maya received an invitation to speak at a national conference on diversity in the legal profession. The invitation came from a group that worked to promote inclusivity and equality in the legal field, and they had been following her story closely. It was a prestigious event, one that would bring together prominent attorneys, judges, and legal scholars to discuss the challenges and barriers faced by marginalized groups within the law. Maya saw this as the perfect opportunity to take her story to a broader stage, to not only highlight her own experience, but to advocate for lasting change. She spent the next few days preparing her speech. It wasn't just about recounting the events of the courtroom. It was about speaking to the heart of the issue. Why this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that harmed not just individuals, but the integrity of the entire system. She wanted to use her platform to ask the hard questions. Why were Black women still struggling to be seen as equals in spaces they were more than qualified to occupy? Why was bias so deeply ingrained in the very structures that were supposed to ensure justice? Maya knew this would be a difficult conversation, one that would make some people uncomfortable, but she also knew that discomfort was the first step toward real change. She couldn't shy away from it. The night before the conference, Maya sat in her hotel room, reviewing her notes. The weight of what she was about to do was heavy, but it didn't intimidate her. It strengthened her resolve. She had been in high-pressure situations before, courtroom battles, investigations, cases that had tested her resolve. But this was different. This wasn't just about legal strategy. This was about her life, her identity, and the lives of so many others who had faced similar struggles. It was about confronting the very systems that had shaped her career and asking them to be better. The morning of the conference, Maya stood before a packed auditorium, her heart steady but her mind sharp. She walked up to the podium, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, attorneys, judges, scholars, and students. She had their attention, but now it was time to hold it. She took a deep breath and began her speech, recounting her experience in the courtroom, the judge's dismissal of her, and how the ensuing public conversation had become a catalyst for change. She talked about the implicit biases that permeated the legal system and how they affected not just the people who were the victims of those biases, but the system itself. "I'm here today not because of one judge's mistake," she said, her voice strong. "I'm here because that mistake is part of something much larger. It's part of a system that doesn't always see people like me. It's part of a system that can't afford to keep turning a blind eye to the bias that's ingrained in the way we think, in the way we practice law, and in the way we make decisions." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "We can no longer pretend that these issues don't exist. We must do the work to confront them, to unlearn the biases that have shaped our profession, and to make sure that everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the shape of their gender, has a fair chance to be seen for who they truly are." The room was silent for a moment before a wave of applause swept through the audience. Maya could feel the energy in the room shift, the collective understanding that this conversation, as difficult as it might be, was necessary. She had made her point, and the audience had heard it loud and clear. As Maya left the stage, she felt a sense of fulfillment. She had spoken her truth, and she had sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. But as the applause died down and the conference continued, Maya knew that the real work was only just beginning. She had opened a door, and now it was up to everyone in that room, and beyond it, to take the next steps toward change. In the weeks following her speech at the conference, Maya began to see the ripple effects of her words. The conversation about racial bias in the legal profession continued to grow, moving from private discussions to public forums. Legal organizations, law schools, and even some judicial bodies began to implement programs and training to address implicit bias and foster inclusivity. Maya's story had opened a door, but now the real challenge was ensuring that the momentum didn't fade. She received numerous invitations to speak at various events, from panel discussions to university lectures, and each time she spoke, her message became more refined, more urgent. She was no longer just recounting her experience. She was shaping a vision for change. But despite the progress, there were moments of doubt. Maya had been in this system long enough to know how difficult change could be, and even though people were listening now, she couldn't help but wonder how long it would take for these conversations to translate into real, lasting change. One afternoon, she was back in her office at the federal courthouse, sorting through case files when her assistant brought in a visitor. "Maya, there's someone here to see you," her assistant said, peeking her head around the door. "She says it's urgent." Maya glanced at the clock. It was late in the afternoon, and she had planned to finish up some paperwork before heading home. Still, her curiosity piqued. "Who is it?" "She wouldn't give a name, just said you'd know her," her assistant said, clearly intrigued. "She insists it's important." "Okay, send her in," Maya replied, sitting back in her chair. A few moments later, the door opened and a woman stepped inside. Maya stood up instinctively, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized the woman standing before her. It was Judge Anderson, the same judge who had fined her weeks earlier. "Judge Anderson," Maya said, her voice even, though there was no mistaking the surprise in her tone. "What can I do for you?" The judge, looking more worn than when they had last spoken, stepped forward cautiously. He wasn't wearing his robe, and his usually stern expression was softened by what Maya could only describe as an apology that had yet to be fully expressed. "Maya, I wanted to come here personally to speak with you," he said, his voice unsteady. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I need to apologize again. But this time, I want to do more than apologize." Maya crossed her arms, watching him carefully. She had been prepared to move on from their interaction in the courtroom, but seeing him here, in her office, caught her off guard. What do you mean do more? I've been having conversations with colleagues, he continued, and I've been reflecting on the biases I've carried, whether I realized it or not. I know I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and that's not something I can take lightly. He paused, clearly searching for the right words. I've been in this field for a long time, and I always thought I was doing the right thing. But what I didn't realize was how deeply embedded my own biases were. Maya remained silent, listening intently. She had been prepared for a brief, insincere apology, but this seemed different. He wasn't just acknowledging the mistake in their courtroom. He was grappling with his own understanding of the issue. I want to make this right, Judge Anderson said finally. I'm planning to work with an organization that trains judges on racial bias. I've committed to attending their programs and working toward a deeper understanding of the systemic issues at play. But I need to do more. I want to use my position to influence change, not just apologize for a past mistake. Maya regarded him for a long moment, her arms still crossed. This was unexpected, but perhaps it was exactly what the moment needed. I appreciate your words, Judge, but actions speak louder than apologies. If you're serious about change, you need to use your position to create accountability, not just for yourself, but for others in the system. I know, he replied, his voice firm with resolve. I've already started to advocate for broader changes. I've spoken to my colleagues, and we're planning on creating a mentorship program for young lawyers of color, helping them gain access to the resources they need to rise in the profession. And I want to make sure that every judge under my influence is held accountable for their actions and their biases. I can't undo what's been done, but I will do everything I can to make sure it doesn't happen again. Maya felt a shift in the room, the tension easing. While she knew it wasn't enough for one man to undo decades of systemic problems, the sincerity in his voice told her that this could be a turning point, not just for him, but for others who were willing to listen and change. She stood up and extended her hand. Then let's hold each other accountable, she said. If you're truly committed to this, I'll help however I can. Judge Anderson shook her hand firmly. Thank you, Maya. I won't let you down. As he left her office, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of cautious optimism. She knew that change would take time, but she was beginning to see that the conversations she had started were beginning to evolve into tangible actions. This was just one step, but it was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in a long while, Maya felt that the path ahead might lead to something better. Over the next several months, Maya continued to be a driving force in the ongoing conversation about racial bias in the legal system. While some of the initial momentum from her story had started to slow, the foundations for change were solidifying. Judge Anderson, true to his word, had made significant strides in advocating for reforms within the judicial system. He had partnered with a number of organizations to provide educational resources for judges and lawyers about implicit bias and its effects. Maya even participated in a few of those programs, sharing her experience and insights, and encouraging others to open their eyes to the ways biases shape decisions in courtrooms nationwide. Despite the progress, Maya knew that real change would take time. Some of her colleagues were skeptical about how much could truly be accomplished in the long term. They were quick to point out that bias training and awareness could only go so far without deeper structural changes in the way the legal system functioned. Maya agreed with them, but she also recognized that this was a long game. Every bit of awareness raised, every conversation initiated, was a step towards systemic transformation. One evening, Maya sat at her desk, reviewing case files for an upcoming trial. The city was beginning to quiet down outside her office, the soft hum of traffic barely audible through the windows. Maya had always been someone who thrived on the work, the complex cases, the intricate legal arguments, the pursuit of justice, but lately, something had started to weigh on her. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, her mind drifting for a moment. Her thoughts returned to the journey she had taken, from the moment in that courtroom with Judge Anderson to the many conversations she'd had since. Despite the progress, she couldn't help but wonder whether the real change was going to come quickly enough. How many more Black women, how many more professionals of color would be dismissed, ignored, or marginalized before the system truly reformed? Her phone rang, snapping her out of her reverie. It was Carla Simmons, the journalist who had helped bring her story to the public eye. Maya picked up the call, glad to hear a familiar voice. Maya, I've been following your work lately, Carla began. I wanted to check in and see how everything is going. It's been a while since we last spoke. Maya smiled a little. Carla had been one of the first people to amplify her voice, and their conversations had continued even after the initial media storm. Things are moving forward, Maya replied. It's slow, but it's something. Judge Anderson's initiative is gaining traction, and people are starting to listen. But I think we're just scratching the surface. Carla paused before speaking again. I've been talking to some people in the community, particularly lawyers and legal scholars, and a lot of them agree with you. They say that the work you've been doing is important, but we still need more people in power to acknowledge the depth of the problem. People like you, Maya, are setting an example. You've opened a door, but now we need to make sure people are walking through it. Maya nodded, even though Carla couldn't see her. It was a sentiment Maya had heard from others as well. I agree. This is just the beginning. The more we do, the more we expose. But it's also about building relationships, opening channels of communication, and making sure that when we speak up, others join us. I was thinking, Carla continued, her voice thoughtful, that it's time for you to write a book. Your story, yes, but more importantly, what you're doing now, how you're reshaping the conversation around race and bias in the legal system. It's something people need to read, hear, and understand. Maya was silent for a moment. A book? It was an idea that had crossed her mind, but she hadn't seriously considered it. She wasn't sure she was ready to take on such a big project. The idea of putting her thoughts into words, of cataloging everything she had learned and experienced, felt both daunting and necessary. That's a big step, Maya finally said. I've thought about it, but I'm not sure I'm the best person for it. You already are, Carla replied firmly. Your story has already made such an impact, Maya. But this could take it even further. People need to understand what this fight looks like on a personal level, how systemic bias affects people's lives in ways they don't see. You've been doing that work for years. It's time to share that journey with the world. Maya's mind raced, but deep down, she knew Carla was right. Writing a book would be another challenge, but it would also be another opportunity to bring people into the conversation. She had always believed that the fight for equality and fairness didn't stop in the courtroom. It had to extend into the broader culture, where people's perceptions were shaped and decisions were made long before they ever entered a legal space. I'll think about it, Maya said finally, her voice steady but filled with resolve. Maybe it's time to share the full story, not just mine, but the stories of all the people who are still fighting for the same things I've been fighting for. Carla's voice was warm with encouragement. I think it's time, Maya. As the call ended, Maya sat in the quiet of her office, her thoughts swirling. She had been given so many opportunities to amplify her voice, but this, writing a book, was different. It was a daunting task, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it could be a powerful way to bring people into the movement she was a part of, to give others the tools to recognize and fight bias in their own lives. Maybe this was the next step. Maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take it. Months passed, and Maya found herself standing at a crossroads. She had been traveling the country, speaking at conferences, participating in panel discussions, and meeting with legal organizations about racial bias in the legal system. She had become a public figure, a voice for change, for inclusion, and for accountability. But despite the success and the growing influence she had gained, the weight of what she was advocating for remained immense. The road to change was not linear, and the challenges, though they seemed to be less overt now, were still there. The book idea had never left her mind. She spent countless late nights thinking about it, considering what her story could mean for the larger movement. She had a platform now, and her experiences, both as a federal prosecutor and as a Black woman who had faced discrimination, could serve as a bridge for others to understand the complexities of race, bias, and justice. But writing a book was a different beast entirely. It wasn't just a series of speeches or interviews. It was personal, deep, and vulnerable. It was about laying bare not just the triumphs, but also the scars left by years of inequality. One afternoon, Maya sat at her kitchen table, papers scattered in front of her. She was working on an outline for the book, considering how to structure it. She wanted it to be a narrative, one that would blend her own journey with the broader story of systemic bias in the legal system. She wanted people to feel what it was like to be in her shoes, to understand how deeply entrenched the biases were, and how even small acts of ignorance could cause long-lasting harm. As she wrote, Maya thought about the people who had supported her along the way. The friends, the colleagues, the community that had rallied behind her when the judge's dismissive comments had gone viral. The support she had received was overwhelming, but Maya knew that behind that support was a larger question. Could the system change? Could it truly evolve in a way that dismantled the layers of prejudice embedded within it? Could a legal system built on centuries of bias and injustice ever be reformed? Maya realized that her book would not just be about confronting the past, but also about finding a way forward. She would share her story, but she would also highlight the work that was being done to change the system. She wanted her readers to understand that this fight was far from over, but it was not a hopeless one either. There were people like Judge Anderson, judges, attorneys, and legal experts who were committed to making real change, and they were pushing forward in small but powerful ways. It wasn't just the legal community that was changing. The country was beginning to have the conversations that Maya had always hoped for. From social media movements to public protests, more and more people were joining the fight against racial injustice. Maya felt, for the first time, that the winds of change were shifting in a real way. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't fast, but it was progress. One evening, Maya received a call from Judge Anderson. He wanted to meet in person. She hadn't heard from him in a while, but their last conversation had left her with a cautious optimism. She agreed to meet him the next day at a local cafe. When they met, Maya was surprised to see how much he had changed. His demeanor was more humble than before, and he spoke with a sense of urgency. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Judge Anderson started, his voice serious. "The work we're doing isn't enough. We've started the conversation, but we need to do more. I've been speaking with other judges, and I think we need to introduce a nationwide initiative for all courts to participate in bias training, not just once, but regularly. I'm working with several organizations to make that happen." Maya smiled, feeling a genuine sense of hope. "That's great to hear," she said, "but it can't stop there. Bias training is important, but we need to make sure that it leads to meaningful changes in how cases are handled, how decisions are made, and how people are treated when they walk into a courtroom." "I know," Judge Anderson agreed, "but this is a start, Maya. I've spoken with a few colleagues, and I'm pushing for new policies that ensure judges, attorneys, and staff are regularly held accountable. We can't just talk about it. We need to make it a requirement." Maya felt a surge of hope. It was one thing to apologize, but it was another to actively push for reform. She realized that change was still possible, but it would take the collective efforts of many. People like Judge Anderson, who were willing to look at their own biases and push for a better system. After their meeting, Maya felt energized. Her book was taking shape, and the more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't just her story. It was everyone's story. It was about the people who had fought before her and those who would come after. It was about a movement that wasn't just about a moment, but a lasting change that would ripple through generations. The following week, Maya signed the contract to write her book. It was an exciting yet daunting step forward. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. Her story, the story of so many others, would be told, and she was determined that it would be the first step in a much larger journey toward justice and equality.